The courthouse was always cold, no matter the season. Federal Prosecutor Elijah Carter adjusted his tie and straightened his shoulders as he stepped into Courtroom 3B. The echo of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. He had been here many times before, presenting airtight cases, winning hard-fought battles, but today, something felt different. Across the room, Judge Walter Grayson loomed from his elevated bench, an emblem of judicial authority. He was the type of man who carried his power like a scepter, commanding respect with a mere glance. But that respect, Elijah knew, was rarely extended to people who looked like him. As the proceedings began, Elijah's voice rang clear and steady. His opening arguments were meticulously prepared, his case against Marcus Avery, a young black accountant accused of embezzling from his firm, built on evidence so solid it seemed unshakable. Yet, within minutes, the cracks began to show, not in Elijah's case, but in the system itself. "Mr. Carter," Judge Grayson interrupted, his tone clipped. "Spare us the dramatics. Just get to the point." Elijah paused mid-sentence, momentarily thrown. His presentation had been concise, professional. The comment was unwarranted. He pushed forward, only for the judge to cut him off again moments later. "Are you suggesting that your interpretation of the evidence is more credible than that of the defense?" Grayson's question dripped with condescension. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Grayson said them, his gaze heavy with something unspoken, something Elijah had seen too many times before. The defense attorney smirked, emboldened by the judge's demeanor. Meanwhile, the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Elijah and the bench. By the time the court recessed for lunch, Elijah's frustration was barely contained. He retreated to his office, his fists clenched as he replayed the morning's events. It wasn't just that Grayson was being difficult, he was undermining Elijah at every turn, subtly eroding his credibility in front of the jury. "Don't let it get to you," said Naomi King, Elijah's colleague and confidant, when he confided in her. "You're better than this. Stick to the facts. Win them over." But Naomi's words, though well-intentioned, did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't about facts or strategy. This was about something deeper, something systemic. The next day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Elijah presented a key piece of evidence, a financial audit that clearly implicated Marcus Avery. It should have been a turning point in the trial. But Judge Grayson dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "This is speculative at best," the judge declared, despite the document's clarity. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, this evidence was vetted thoroughly by forensic accountants." "Enough, Mr. Carter," Grayson interrupted, his voice rising. "I won't have you wasting the court's time." The jury exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah could feel the balance of the trial slipping away, not because of the facts, but because of the man presiding over them. During a recess, Elijah sat in the quiet solitude of his office, staring at the photograph on his desk, a picture of his late father, a civil rights attorney who had faced his own battles in the fight for justice. "You'll always have to work twice as hard," his father used to say. "But never let them see you break." Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next round. Back in the courtroom, he recalibrated his approach, focusing on the jury. He spoke with passion and precision, painting a vivid picture of the evidence. But no matter how compelling his arguments, Grayson found ways to undermine him. Objections were sustained against Elijah with a frequency that bordered on absurdity. When the defense faltered, Grayson intervened, offering suggestions thinly veiled as clarifications. It was becoming clear to everyone in the room, this wasn't a fair fight. That evening, Elijah met with Sophia Morales, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in high places. Over coffee in a dimly lit diner, he shared his suspicions. "Grayson's bias isn't just personal," Elijah said. "It's systemic. He's been doing this for years, and no one's called him out." Sophia leaned forward, her pen poised. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," Elijah admitted. "But I'm going to find it." Sophia's eyes gleamed with determination. "Let me help." If there's a story here, I'll find it. As the trial dragged on, Elijah juggled the weight of his case and the mounting evidence of Grayson's prejudice. Late nights were spent poring over court transcripts, searching for patterns, while Sophia chased leads. The courtroom became a battlefield, each day a test of Elijah's resolve. Grayson's remarks grew sharper, his rulings more overtly biased. Yet, Elijah refused to back down, his determination shining through every word he spoke. By the time the trial neared its conclusion, it was clear that this case was about more than Marcus Avery. It was about a system that allowed prejudice to fester in the very place meant to uphold justice. And Elijah Carter was ready to fight, not just for his client, but for the truth. The courthouse lights flickered faintly as Elijah sat alone in his office late into the night, a mountain of documents scattered across his desk. His laptop screen glowed dimly, displaying old case transcripts presided over by Judge Grayson. It wasn't just this case, Elijah was now looking at a troubling pattern. Time and time again, Grayson's rulings disproportionately affected black and minority defendants. Subtle but undeniable, harsher sentences, dismissals of key evidence, and language in court transcripts that echoed the same condescension Elijah had experienced. A knock on the door broke the silence. It was Sophia Morales, her leather satchel slung over one shoulder and her ever-present notebook in hand. "Got something for you," she said, tossing a thin folder onto his desk. Inside were testimonies from clerks who had worked under Grayson, anonymously, of course. They described a man who was meticulous in his legal knowledge but carried unspoken prejudices into his courtroom. One clerk recounted how Grayson would casually refer to black attorneys as too emotional or not polished enough in private conversations. Another noted that Grayson seemed to go out of his way to dismiss minority defendants' arguments as frivolous. Elijah's stomach turned as he read. It was worse than he'd imagined. Sophia leaned back in her chair. "This guy's been skating on a thin line for years. He's careful, though. Never anything blatant, but the pattern's there. You just have to make the public see it." Elijah nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "Even if we prove bias, how does that help me win this trial? He's the judge, and he's got the jury under his thumb." Sophia smirked. "You don't beat someone like Grayson by playing by his rules. You expose him. Publicly." Elijah stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. He knew she was right. The next day, Elijah walked into the courtroom with renewed resolve. Grayson's usual smirk greeted him from the bench, but Elijah ignored it. He presented his evidence with precision, steering clear of Grayson's interruptions by addressing the jury directly. He emphasized the facts, layering his arguments with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. But just as he began to gain traction, Grayson struck again. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice cold and deliberate, "if you continue to skirt around the law with these insinuations, I'll have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Elijah froze. The courtroom fell silent. Even the jury seemed stunned by the blatant threat. Taking a deep breath, Elijah stepped back from the podium. "Your Honor, I'm simply presenting the evidence. The jury deserves to hear the full scope of this case." Grayson's glare was icy. "Consider this your final warning." The moment passed, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. That evening, Elijah and Sophia met in secret at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. "I'm going to challenge him in court," Elijah said, his voice low but resolute. "File a motion to recuse him for bias." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "You think that'll work?" "It won't," Elijah admitted. "Not in the short term. But it'll put his behavior on record, and it'll give us a foothold. Meanwhile, you keep digging. If we're going to expose him, we need undeniable proof." Sophia grinned. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." The motion to recuse Grayson was filed the next morning, and predictably, it was denied. But Elijah had anticipated this. The motion wasn't about removing Grayson, it was about creating a paper trail, a record that could be used later. Word of the motion spread quickly, and by the end of the day, whispers about Grayson's alleged bias had reached the courthouse's highest corridors. Meanwhile, Sophia's investigation gained momentum. Through meticulous research, she unearthed a treasure trove of old cases that painted a damning picture. There were off-the-record comments from former clerks, disparities in sentencing data, and even footage of Grayson dismissing black defendants in open court with a dismissiveness that bordered on contempt. Sophia published her findings in a scathing article titled, "The Hidden Bias of a Federal Judge." The piece went viral overnight, sparking outrage across the legal community. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Grayson was visibly on edge, his usual composure cracking under the weight of the growing scandal. Elijah seized the moment. He began incorporating subtle references to fairness and equality into his arguments, forcing the jury to question the impartiality of the proceedings. Grayson's interruptions became more frequent, more aggressive. But with every outburst, the jury grew more uneasy. As the trial neared its conclusion, Elijah prepared for his closing argument. He knew this was his chance, not just to win the case, but to shine a light on the deeper issues at play. "You're risking everything," Naomi said that night as they reviewed his draft. "If you push too hard, he could have you disbarred." Elijah looked her in the eye, his expression unwavering. "If I don't push, nothing changes. Not for me, not for the next guy who steps into this courtroom. It's not just about Marcus Avery anymore. It's about all of us." Naomi nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. This trial has been about more than just the facts. It's been about trust, trust in the evidence, trust in the law, and trust in the system meant to uphold it. But what happens when that trust is broken? When the scales of justice are tipped before the first argument is made? His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The jury leaned forward, captivated. Grayson shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Elijah continued, his voice rising. "The truth is, bias, whether overt or subtle, has no place in this courtroom. And yet, we've seen it. We've felt it. But justice isn't just about the letter of the law. It's about the spirit of it. It's about ensuring that every person, no matter their background, is given a fair chance." The courtroom was silent as Elijah returned to his seat. For the first time in the trial, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the jury deliberated, Elijah couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Win or lose, he knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. The courtroom was unbearably silent as the jury filed out to deliberate. Elijah Carter remained seated at the prosecution table, staring at his notes but seeing none of the words. His mind churned with doubt. Had he done enough? Had he said too much? Across the room, Judge Walter Grayson sat stiffly on the bench, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was palpable. A silent battle waged in the minds of everyone present. The jury wasn't just deliberating Marcus Avery's fate, they were weighing the credibility of the system itself. Elijah's phone buzzed softly. A message from Sophia Morales lit up the screen. "New lead. Need to talk. Urgent." Elijah slipped out of the courtroom during the recess and found Sophia waiting outside, her expression as sharp as ever. "I got my hands on an email," she said, holding up her phone. "It's from Grayson's office, dated a few months ago. It's not overt, but it's bad. He basically advises a colleague to keep certain attorneys in check because they don't always understand their place." Elijah's jaw tightened. "That's it. That's the thread we need to pull." Sophia nodded. "If we can prove a pattern of bias, if we can show this is bigger than just you and Avery, it'll force accountability. But you have to be careful. If you bring this into court the wrong way, Grayson could blow up. He'll take you down with him." Elijah took a deep breath. "I'll handle it." The following day, the jury returned to the courtroom, their faces a mix of weariness and determination. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant, Marcus Avery, not guilty. The words hit like a thunderclap. A wave of relief washed over Elijah as murmurs filled the courtroom. Marcus Avery let out an audible gasp, his hands trembling as he glanced at Elijah. But the moment of triumph was fleeting. Judge Grayson's gavel came down hard, silencing the room. His face was red with barely restrained anger. "This courtroom is not a spectacle," he growled. "Control yourselves." Elijah could feel Grayson's fury radiating toward him. The judge had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. Later that evening, Elijah and Marcus met outside the courthouse. Marcus looked like a man who had just woken from a nightmare, unsure of whether he was truly free. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to," Elijah replied. "Just take this second chance and make it count." Marcus nodded, but Elijah's mind was elsewhere. The trial was over. But the fight wasn't. Grayson's bias had nearly cost an innocent man his freedom, and Elijah wasn't about to let that slide. The next week, Elijah filed a formal complaint against Judge Grayson with the Judicial Ethics Committee. The complaint, bolstered by Sophia's investigative work, detailed a pattern of biased behavior spanning years. Transcripts, anonymous testimonies, sentencing disparities, and even the damning email Sophia had uncovered, all of it painted a grim picture of a man who had allowed prejudice to taint his rulings. The move was bold and risky. Judges were rarely held accountable for their actions, especially one as entrenched and powerful as Grayson. But Elijah had no intention of backing down. The courthouse buzzed with rumors as news of the complaint spread. Grayson, uncharacteristically silent, seemed to grow more irritable with each passing day. His once commanding presence now seemed brittle, as if a single push might shatter the carefully constructed facade. A month later, the Ethics Committee convened a hearing to address the allegations against Grayson. The courtroom was packed with reporters, attorneys, and spectators, all eager to see how the drama would unfold. Elijah, seated at the witness stand, recounted his experiences with Grayson in painstaking detail. He described the judge's dismissive comments, his biased rulings, and the pervasive atmosphere of hostility that hung over the courtroom. Sophia, called as an expert witness, presented her findings with surgical precision. She walked the committee through Grayson's record, pointing out the patterns and inconsistencies that revealed his bias. Grayson, for his part, denied everything. He dismissed the allegations as baseless attacks and accused Elijah of trying to undermine the integrity of the judiciary. But the evidence was damning. When the email Sophia had uncovered was presented, a hush fell over the room. Grayson's lawyer fumbled for a rebuttal, but the damage was done. By the end of the hearing, the committee announced its decision: Grayson's conduct had violated judicial ethics. The judge was suspended pending further investigation, and the scandal quickly made national headlines. As Elijah left the hearing, a crowd of reporters swarmed him, their questions overlapping in a chaotic blur. "Do you feel vindicated? What does this mean for your career? What's next for you, Mr. Carter?" Elijah paused, his face calm but resolute. "This isn't about me. It's about ensuring that the justice system works for everyone, not just those it's designed to protect. This is just the beginning." The suspension of Judge Walter Grayson sent shockwaves through the legal community. It was a rare, almost unprecedented moment. A federal judge held accountable for his actions. Yet for Elijah Carter, the victory was bittersweet. The man was temporarily removed from the bench. But the systemic issues that had allowed his behavior to thrive remained firmly entrenched. Elijah sat in his office, the faint hum of city traffic drifting through the window. A copy of the Washington Post lay open on his desk, the headline glaring back at him: "Federal Judge Suspended Amid Allegations of Racial Bias." Below it, a photo of Grayson, grim-faced and tight-lipped, sat beside a smaller image of Elijah himself, the words, "Prosecutor Who Sparked Change," printed beneath. Naomi King entered, a coffee in each hand. "You're famous," she teased, setting one cup on his desk. "Infamous, more like," Elijah replied with a faint smile. He gestured toward the newspaper. This is just a start. Grayson's gone. But the system that enabled him is still here. Naomi sat across from him, her expression serious. So, what's next? You've shaken the foundations, Elijah. Now you have to decide whether you're rebuilding or tearing the whole thing down. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of the question settling over him. The hearing into Grayson's misconduct wasn't just a blow to his career, it was a reckoning for the judiciary. As more reporters dug into his past cases, the scope of his bias became undeniable. Cases were reopened, sentences scrutinized, and one by one, the pieces of Grayson's legacy began to crumble. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself thrust into the spotlight. Invitations to speak at legal conferences and civil rights panels poured in. Universities wanted him to lecture. Advocacy groups begged him to lend his voice to their causes. But Elijah's focus remained on the courthouse. He still had cases to try, lives to fight for. And though he'd won the battle against Grayson, he knew he was far from winning the war. One of those lives was Marcus Avery, who had returned to his family and was slowly rebuilding his career. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by Elijah's office unexpectedly, a small gift bag in hand. I just wanted to say thank you, Marcus said, setting the bag on Elijah's desk. Not just for defending me, but for standing up to him. What you did, it mattered. To a lot of us. Elijah opened the bag and pulled out a framed photograph. It was a black and white image of Thurgood Marshall standing outside the Supreme Court, his face alight with determination. Marcus smiled. Thought you might need a reminder that what you're doing isn't just about today. Elijah's throat tightened. Thank you, Marcus. This means a lot. Months later. The courthouse was abuzz with a new case, one that Elijah was prosecuting. It was another high-profile trial, but this time, the air in the courtroom felt different. The new judge, a woman with a reputation for fairness and a no-nonsense attitude, presided with a calm authority. Her presence was a stark contrast to Grayson's domineering style. As Elijah presented his opening arguments, he couldn't help but notice how the jury leaned forward, attentive and engaged. For the first time in what felt like forever. He didn't have to fight against the weight of the bench. But the real test came during a break in the proceedings. Elijah stepped into the hallway to find a group of young black law students waiting for him, their eyes wide with admiration. Mr. Carter, one of them said, his voice trembling slightly. We just wanted to say how much you inspire us. Seeing someone like you take on a system that feels impossible to change, it gives us hope. Elijah smiled, shaking their hands one by one. The system doesn't change overnight, he told them. But every case, every argument, it all adds up. Don't stop fighting. That evening, Elijah met Sophia at their usual diner. The place had become their unofficial war room during the Grayson ordeal, but tonight, it felt like a sanctuary. Sophia raised her coffee mug in a mock toast. To taking down giants. Elijah chuckled, clinking his glass of water against her mug. To the people who keep the fight going. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. You know, Elijah, you've become more than just a prosecutor. People are looking to you now, not just for justice in the courtroom, but for leadership outside of it. Have you thought about what's next? Elijah hesitated. He had thought about it, about running for office, about joining a civil rights organization, about pushing for systemic reforms on a broader scale. But each time, he came back to the same conclusion. I think my place is here, he said finally. In the courtroom. Fighting case by case. That's where I can make the most difference. Sophia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. You'll change the system one case at a time, then. As Elijah walked home that night, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Grayson was gone. Marcus was free. And the justice system, flawed as it was, had taken its first step towards something better. Elijah paused outside the courthouse, its towering facade illuminated against the night sky. He clenched his fists, his father's voice echoing in his mind, "Never let them see you break." He hadn't. And he wouldn't. The dawn of a new era was coming. And Elijah Carter would be there to see it through.